Thank you very much. Today we are starting our series of webinars to try to share among us our methodologies and our disciplinary background in order to make sense of what we are doing in the branch project. And Samuele and I we will present about oral history. Please, Samuele. And the next slide is the I will go with introduction precisely. So let's start with genealogies of oral history. In this slide, I'm trying to synthesize the main roots for oral history. And I think the main roots are these four that you see in the slide: folk studies, non-professional historians, non-European histories, and new social history. So folk studies. It was at least since the 1950s that especially in UK, in Scotland, and in Wales, we had this kind of recording programs in which especially museums and other cultural centers, but also, for instance, the School of Scottish Studies at Edinburgh University, they started to record uh, especially folk traditions, culture, music, and so on and so forth. So the folk studies is an important route for oral history. Then I am also mentioning non-professional historians. And I would like to mention here this specific case in the 1930s. The New Deal was the famous policy created by Franklin Delano Roosevelt to deal with the economic crisis of the 1929. Well, part of the New Deal was also this Federal Writer Project, which employed 6,000 writers, and those 6,000 writers interviewed 10,000 people. And I like to mention this because many times, I mean, I think that this also says something about the way in which we think about the crisis and the kind of disciplines that are needed to face a crisis. Now, you can see here that in the 1930s, actually, there was an idea that writers, that humanities could contribute somehow to deal with the gigantic crisis of the 1930s. Non-European histories, well, here the point was especially to react against the colonial archive. Of course, when historians, scholars were looking at the histories of the colonies, they couldn't only rely on the colonial archive because the colonial archive, by definition, didn't include the voices of the people who were colonized, or at least the colonial archive included them in a very peculiar way. This point is also well connected with the last route, which is the new social history. So, especially starting from the 1970s, historians began to look at different subjects in history. There was a time, maybe some of us still remember that time, when history was basically something related with the big men. And I say men not by mistake, I really mean men. So, history was the history of Napoleon, of Julius Caesar, maybe of Roosevelt precisely, Mussolini or somebody else, but it was not the history of the common people. And in the 1970s, especially under the pressure of social movements, I am thinking here of New Left, historians started to look at other kind of historical subjects: workers, women, children, subalterns, peasants, and of course, those people rarely had some kind of written uh, sources. No, those people were not living. They didn't leave, diaries telling about themselves. They didn't have a lot of letters written among themselves, and so on and so forth. So for those subject, oral history was even more important. And you see the connection with the previous route, the non-European histories. So the idea of trying to recover histories that were not present in the archives. Please, the next slide. So the aims of oral history is giving voice to subaltern, marginal, non the usual suspects, and uncovering hidden histories. So, however, If you look at the yellow box here in this slide, you also realize that actually oral history didn't start precisely with this agenda, because the first project on oral history at the Columbia University in New York in the 1948 was not a project about workers, poor people, women, but was actually an oral history project on white male elites, especially entrepreneurs, businessmen. And so you see that actually oral history was not necessarily something connected, related with, a bottom up, or we could say democratic approach. Oral history is also a very important field, especially for Italian historians and historiography. We will see in the next slide that Alessandro Portelli and Luisa Passerini, two historians, have been extremely influential globally for their contribution to oral history. And when we think of historiography in the last 2 centuries, maybe the two most relevant innovations coming from Italy were precisely oral history on one side. The other one was something called microhistory, but we don't have time to discuss microhistory today. So Luisa Passerini is important because she was making a point about an easy democratization and a complacent populism of oral history projects. Because the idea is not, there can be a very naive idea. We give a microphone to somebody, a worker or a peasant or whatever, and then this person will finally, share the true memory of their class and so on. While Luisa Passerini is remembering us that we need to remember to consider how those memories, the memories of these subaltern people, were influenced by dominant histories and thus require critical interpretation. In other words, it is crucial to ask how gender, race, and class, as structural and ideological relations, have shaped the construction of historical memory. Maybe it's better to give you one example to clarify this point. I can go to a working class neighborhood and start interviewing, for instance, female workers in the neighborhood. Then maybe one of them can tell us about, when she was a worker, she was working in this factory. She could tell us that, at that time when she was working, it was, fine for the owner, the boss in the factory, to do something that today we would call harassment. Okay, and she could, laugh about this and say that, in the end it was completely fine, it was just a joke, and so on and so forth. So what I am trying to say with this example, and this is not a whatever example, it's something that actually happened in a research on female workers in Canada. So what we need to understand is that memory is not only an individual thing, but it's also framed, shaped by the structure of society. And if you give a microphone to somebody, this microphone will not free this person from all the structure of power that is also dictating the way in which this person is remembering, reframing their experience. Okay, I hope that maybe the example is a little bit clearer. And then the next slide, well, the critique against oral history. Well, Patrick O'Farrell can speak for everyone, I would say. Now, in 1979, he's saying that oral history was moving into the world of image, selective memory, later overlies and utter subjectivity, and where will it lead us? Not into history, but into myths. Basically, oral history and oral sources are not reliable. I am remembering something from 20 years ago, but we are not sure if things were like that. I am maybe reinventing what happened. So the reaction to this critique, well, on one hand, the first reaction was that oral sources were indeed subjective and, controversial, precisely as any other sources. Because whatever we are using, archival sources, written texts, or oral history, we need, as historians, as scholars, to ask these three basic questions: who produced the sources, why the source was produced, and the audience. So this is not the general, very basic question that historians need to ask. It doesn't matter if I am with a microphone telling something, or if I'm reading a report from the ministry of something. We still need to be critical about the sources that we are reading. And then the second reaction, you can say answer to that critique, was to embrace the peculiarity of oral history. So instead of trying to escape the problem of memory, to make memory as the key point in oral history. And then if we move to the next slide, I have still a couple of minutes to go. So oral sources and perils and opportunities of memory. So precisely as I said before, embracing memory. Alessandro Portelli, I mentioned Alessandro Portelli a minute ago, no, Luisa Passerini, Alessandro Portelli, these two very influential figures worldwide on oral history. Alessandro Portelli argued that oral history sources say, and you see here in the slide, what people did, what they wanted to do, maybe without doing what they wanted to do, what they think they did, because, I don't know about you, but sometimes I think I did something and actually I didn't do what I think I did, and how they feel about they did. So embracing this, how can I say, this conundrum of memories rather than, step back and say, no, we cannot use it because it's tainted by the complication of memories. So precisely, instead of trying to avoid the fallacy of memory, make memory and its function the object of oral history. And memory is not an archive of facts, but a process of meaning making. So through memory, we give meaning to what happened, to what we did, to what we thought. And then the next slide. Well, this is, I don't know if I have time here to explain this too much, but Alessandro Portelli, in one of his very famous book, is mentioning this episode, is talking about the story of this Alfredo Filipponi, and Alfredo Filipponi is imagining a meeting with Togliatti. Togliatti was the secretary of the Italian Communist Party in Terni, an industrial town in the middle of the country, in the middle of Italy. And basically, there is an imaginary quote from Lenin. And this imaginary quote is not from Lenin, is actually a proverb, a popular proverb from the region. So you can say that this is completely fake, doesn't work, didn't happen. But Portelli is also trying to suggest that we can try to understand what this story is telling about the memory as meaning making. The idea that Lenin is actually using the words from the region, and Lenin, how can I say, statement become actually a proverb, and also this imaginary meeting with the secretary of the Italian Communist Party. And I know that I should stop. Maybe we can go to the next. Well, this is some very important question that all researchers should ask themselves when they do oral history, but it can be that Samuele is also talking about this, so I don't need to use my time on this. And there are some links about ethical and legal issue, because there are important ethical and legal issue. Something is also extremely controversial. There is a very famous case in which a university in the US, they were collecting oral history from the IRA, the Revolutionary Army of Northern Ireland, and basically those oral histories were somehow used in the prosecutors of some of the people involved in the action. So you can see there are a lot of controversies. I stop here. I'm sorry, I was using a couple of minutes more. Samuele, the word is yours.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. So I'll try to give some insights about anthropology and oral history. Basically, what Marco was saying, it's something, the oral history is an instrument that anthropology, in a way or another, uses a lot, because anthropology and oral history share the same ideas. So anthropology is based on ethnographic research. What we call ethnographic research is the qualitative research that focuses on the relation in the fieldwork that I am having, not just on the data, on the quantitative data, so how many people are doing something or other things, but which are the relation and how these relations work in a group, in a society, or in a culture. It can be worldwide. I mean, the idea is just to focus on the relations that that you have on your field work. And the main relation, I just put two of them, is the gatekeepers and the informants. The gatekeeper in anthropology, but also I think in oral history and other disciplines, is the person or the persons that that get you in touch with your informants. So it's the person that trusts you and lets you enter in your fieldwork. Of course, we use also surveys and interviews, but mostly this is something that we share also with sociology. But what I want to add, there is no not every anthropologist is how can I say it? There is no everyone is in accordance with that, but from my point of view, my professor's point of view, it's what we call the fieldwork first. So the dense description of what we see and what we experience must be in the first place. The theory interprets, translates, and explains the ethnographic material. The theory, it's the medium to make your ethnographic material comprehensible to yourself and to your readers. And then there is what we call participant observation. Participant observation is a research method where researchers immerse themselves in a particular social setting or group, observing the behaviors, interactions, and practices of the participants. This can be a valuable method for any research project that seeks to understand the experiences of individuals or groups in a particular social context. Participants' observation is a pillar of anthropology, although there are discussion about it, how it should change and how it has changed during the anthropology development and discussion about theory and praxis, but it's still a pillar of it. So the idea is not just observing what we are researching, but also participating in it. And I'll go back to it later. So just a very quick passage about coloniality. So anthropology stems from coloniality. The colonial projects needed experts to get in touch with other societies, to ease the process of occupation, military, spatial, ideological, and political, etc., etc. So anthropology contributed in this in exchange for funds and museum. This situation about anthropology's colonial heritage led to the colonial and post-colonial studies that were widespread also in other disciplines and not just in anthropology. And anthropologists started to question their position of power between the interviewer and the interviewed. Something that was also Marco saying before, how my position, how my presence, social presence changes the memory and the history that the interviewed is telling me. So how can we grant an anthropology that is not colonial in order to really have an output of our research that are real or at least not colonial? So I'm going very fast about this, but the idea is just that today anthropology, at least critique anthropology, highlights the need for self-analysis, for a deeply reflective attitude. So this is one of the main pillars, at least it has been in my studies and in my university experience. So our professors always underline the necessity to enhance the perspective of the interviewed for two main reasons. The first one is methodological, and that is culture and society are not visible and clear topics to be studied being outside the specific group. When we speak about culture and society, we are not seeing something that someone knows and can explain. It's just something that we are, something that we do every day, but it's not something that it can be technically explained. And the second is a political reason. To redeem from coloniality and to grant more just research outputs, the ethnography must grant agency to the interviewed. So these two reasons are a bit of what we could call the pillars of critical anthropology nowadays. So when I refer to the methodological reason is again, that is not the same for every anthropologist, but for my experience and for my studies, I find myself I agree a lot with the ideas of the opaque data. So to unveil cultural elements, one must pay attention to and research the opaque data. What is the opaque data? The opaque data is our common sense expression, silences, amnesia, implicit and unspoken discourses. That when you speak with someone and you are, let's say, asking uh, mm, something about your research, you have to look at that. I will give you an example just very quickly, just to explain what I'm referring to. During my master thesis, I was doing the research in the Apon Alps, and I was doing the research with the miners of marble. And I was one day I was inside the marble quarry, and I was working with this worker that already retired, and a friend of mine that was introducing me to his colleagues that were still working. And it happened that at the moment, the boss of the owner of the quarry came without saying nothing. And of course, he didn't know I was there, not because I couldn't be there, but because of course, I was someone from outside, and that experience led me to understand some of the relation and also the tensions that were existing between the workers, between my friend, and between the boss of the quarry that weren't visible, let's say, weren't explicited, but I could understand them just because of the as I was saying, silences, amnesia, and implicit and unspoken discourses. So I just something that I wanted to add, suggestions from the study of sorcery. Of course, sorcery is one of the pillars of study in anthropology. And there is this study of Jean Favret-Sada about sorcery in France in the 1990s. And I want to cite that because for me it was a turning point comprehension of how I perceive and want to do ethnography. She speaks about affecté, to be affected from the fieldwork. In her case, she speaks about sorcery, so about something that goes beyond culture. No, it's something that we cannot. Maybe we can believe in it, we cannot, but something that is far from us. But for me, also with the normal fieldworks that can be culture, can be societies, can be groups, in order to understand matters such as sorcery or cultural traits that can be very far from one's culture, the researcher must let himself be affected from that culture, suspend every judgment, and try to live the fieldwork. For me, this idea, I'm just mentioning it because it was really interesting to try to close my life. I don't know if it's a clear word, but forget about myself when I'm doing fieldwork and try to immerse myself in the fieldwork in order to let me relate more with the people I'm working with. And the second that also Marco was speaking about before is the political reason, as I was mentioning before, is to give and not only to take, to give voice to the subaltern, to gain the people we are working with to act in history and not just suffer from being invisible in history. And mostly also to give back, as this is something that Ernesto De Martino, one Italian anthropologist, was very important in the subaltern anthropology, to give back the social and the political means to the interviewed. So also to try to make our research not just an extractivist and what can I call it? Taking operation, but also to give back the social and political means to make the research profitable also for them and not just for us as academics. So very quickly, ethical policies. I could mention a lot of them. I just focused on some of those. And so we have the commitment to not reveal anything if the other does not wish to. This is something that maybe we can call as oblivion, and is the condition of trust and establishment of a real relationship between the interviewed and the interviewer. That is essential in order to avoid perpetuating the structural violence that the interviewed is already enduring. Also, the oblivion is, as I said, is the condition of trust. One thing that is very central in anthropology and in ethnography in general, but also in oral history, is the trust. So one must gain the trust of the informants and must not betray it. So as I was saying, the necessity for deep sincerity and the undeniable authenticity, the trust that one must gain, and also one can reach it through the immersion. As I mentioned before, forgetting the ultimate goal of the operation. I'm not there doing research. Of course, I'm doing research. Of course, I am there with some deliverables for my project and everything, but I have to forget about it in a way and try to immerse myself in the fieldwork. So, just going to the end, why all of this is relevant for heritage and climate change, and how it is relevant for range. So with Marco, we were thinking how this thing about oral history and ethnography can be useful for you and for your research. So something that I was thinking about is that the pervasiveness of climate change as a social actor often lies underneath social relations and cultural interactions. It relies on discourses and common sense expressions that are difficult to be socially interpreted. And again, as I was saying before, very often the excessive presence of socially distressful elements turn into silence and becomes opaque in its manifestation. Storytelling, ethnography, and oral history are ways to go beyond that opaqueness. For example, with Marco, we were thinking about, maybe Marco wants to say something later about this, about your work that can be as engineers, how to understand the risks and of the buildings you are working with. And maybe storytelling, ethnography, and oral history could be means to understand better how the people that will and live heritage in the case of the castle, for example. I'm thinking about what every of our cases, how the people that live these places can relate to the building and how they perceive also the security of the building, no? Something like that. I don't know if Marco wants to say something later. I'm just ending. So the narratives tell the story of the living heritage, intended as the assemblage of human and more than human relation that acts through and inside the heritage. Oral history allows for the decolonization of history and creates the possibility for a bottom-up history making. In our case, oral history is an instrument to produce and propose heritage, planning, and conservation policies on a bottom-up level.